Take, for example, a luminous point P, of which the rays impinge on the different parts A, B, C of the retina. At this point P, science localizes vibrations of a certain amplitude and duration. At the same point P, consciousness perceives light. We propose to show, in the course of this study, that they are both right, that there is no essential difference between the light and the movements, provided we restore to movement the unity, indivisibility, and qualitative heterogeneity denied to it by abstract mechanics, provided also that we see insensible qualities, contractions affected by our memory. Science and consciousness would then coincide in the instantaneous. For the moment, all we need to say, without examining too closely into the meaning of the words, is that the point P sends to the retina vibrations of light. What happens then? If the visual image of the point P were not already given, we should indeed have to seek the manner in which it had been engendered, and should soon be confronted by an insoluble problem. But whatever we do, we cannot avoid assuming it to begin with. The sole question is, then, to know how and why this image is chosen to form part of my perception, while an infinite number of other images remain excluded from it. Now I see that the vibrations transmitted from the point P to the various parts of the retina are conducted to the subcortical and cortical optic centers, often to other centers as well, and that these centers sometimes transmit them to motor mechanisms, sometimes provisionally arrest them. The nervous elements concerned are, therefore, what gives efficacy to the disturbance received. They symbolize the indetermination of the will. On their soundness, this indetermination depends, and consequently any injury to these elements, by diminishing our possible action, diminishes perception in the same degree. In other words, if there exist in the material world places where the vibrations received are not mechanically transmitted, if there are, as we said, zones of indetermination, these zones must occur along the path of what is termed the sensory motor process, and hence all must happen as though the rays PA, PB, PC were perceived along this path and afterwards projected into P. Further, while the indetermination is something which escapes experiment and calculation, this is not the case with the nervous elements by which the impression is received and transmitted. These elements are the special concern of the physiologist and the psychologist. On them all the details of external perception would seem to depend, and by them they may be explained. So we may say, if we like, that the disturbance, after having traveled along these nervous elements, after having gained the center, there changes into a conscious image which is subsequently exteriorized at the point P. But when we so express ourselves, we merely bow to the exigencies of the scientific method. We in no way describe the real process. There is not, in fact, an unextended image which forms itself in consciousness and then projects itself into P. The truth is that the point P, the rays which it emits, the retina and the nervous elements affected form a single whole, that the luminous point P is a part of this whole, and that it is really in P and not elsewhere that the image of P is formed and perceived. When we represent things to ourselves in this manner, we do return to the simple convictions of common sense. We all of us began by believing that we grasped the very object, that we perceived it in itself and not in us. When philosophers disdain an idea so simple and so close to reality, it is because the intracerebral process, that diminutive part of perception, appears to them the equivalent of the whole of perception. If we suppress the object perceived and keep the internal process, it seems to them that the image of the object remains, and their belief is easily explained. There are many conditions, such as hallucination and dreams, in which images arise that resemble external perception in all their details, and in such cases the object has disappeared while the brain persists. He holds that the cerebral phenomenon is sufficient for the production of the image, but it must not be forgotten that in all psychical states of this kind, memory plays the chief part. Now we shall try to show later that, when perception, as we understand it, is once admitted, memory must arise, and that this memory has not, any more than perception itself, a cerebral state as its true and complete condition. But without as yet entertaining upon the examination of these 2 points, we will content ourselves with a very simple observation, which indeed has no novelty. In many people who are blind from birth, the visual centers are intact, yet they live and die without having formed a single visual image. Such an image, therefore, cannot appear unless the external object has, once at least, played its part. It must, once at any rate, have been part and parcel with representation. Now this is what we claim, and for the moment all that we require, for we are dealing here with pure perception, and not with perception complicated by memory. Reject then the share of memory, consider perception in its unmixed state, and you will be forced to recognize that there is no image without an object. But from the moment that you thus posit the intracerebral processes besides the external object which causes them, we can clearly see how the image of that object is given with it and in it. How the image should arise from the cerebral movement we shall never understand. When a lesion of the nerves or of the centers interrupts the passage of the nerve vibration, perception is to that extent diminished. Need we be surprised? The office of the nervous system is to utilize that vibration, to convert it into practical deeds, really or virtually accomplished. If for one reason or another, the disturbance cannot pass along, it would be strange if the corresponding perception still took place, since this perception would then connect our body with points of space which no longer directly invite it to make a choice. Sever the optic nerve of an animal, the vibrations issuing from the luminous point can no longer be transmitted to the brain and thence to the motor nerves. The thread, of which the optic nerve is a part and which binds the external object to the motor mechanisms of the animal, is broken. Visual perception has therefore become impotent, and this very impotence is unconsciousness. That matter should be perceived without the help of a nervous system and without organs of sense is not theoretically inconceivable, but it is practically impossible, because such perception would be of no use. It would suit a phantom, not a living, and therefore acting being. We are too much inclined to regard the living body as a world within a world, the nervous system as a separate being, of which the function is, first, to elaborate perceptions and then to create movements. The truth is that my nervous system, interposed between the objects which affect my body and those which I can influence, is a mere conductor, transmitting, sending back, or inhibiting movement. This conductor is composed of an enormous number of threads which stretch from the periphery to the center, and from the center to the periphery. As many threads as pass from the periphery to the center, so many points of space are there able to make an appeal to my will, and to put, so to speak, an elementary question to my motor activity. Every such question is what is termed a perception. Thus perception is diminished by one of its elements each time one of the threads termed sensory is cut, because some part of the external object then becomes unable to appeal to activity. And it is also diminished whenever a stable habit has been formed, because this time the ready-made response renders the question unnecessary. What disappears in either case is the apparent reflection of the stimulus upon itself, the return of the light on the image whence it comes, or rather that dissociation, that discernment, whereby the perception is disengaged from the image. We may therefore say that while the detail of perception is molded exactly upon that of the nerves termed sensory, perception as a whole has its true and final explanation in the tendency of the body to movement.